The Cold War was not an armed conflict, but rather a series of ideological conflicts between the United States of America and the Soviet Union, capitalism versus communism. It spanned the years of 1945 to 1991. These two economic and political systems were the primary reason for conflict. Capitalism is a system in which the economy is primarily run by private enterprise for a profit, and the government does not interfere much. Communism, or at least the version the Soviets used, was a system in which the state controls everything and allows very little political freedom.
Beginning in 1945, the U.S. and USSR started a long-lasting distrust of one another due to Stalin's scorched earth policy and little care to the rebuilding of Europe, as well as the U.S.'s reluctance to invade Germany. After the war had ended, Germany was split in two, between East and West, with Berlin itself being divided into two. The Soviets occupied all territory they had invaded during the Second World War and imposed regimes that were friendly towards them. However, they felt threatened by the U.S. and its allies controlling West Berlin. So, in 1949, they blocked off the city and refused entrance until the city was given to them. This was remedied by an airlift that brought in everything the city needed. This was the first of many hostilities the Soviets would instigate.
In 1950, Kim Il-sung rallied the forces of North Korea in an attempt to unify the country under one communist rule. Within 2 days of the invasion, U.S. President Harry Truman convinced the United Nations to declare support for South Korea. The U.S. military was able to push North Korean forces back to the original border and continued their assault into North Korea. Before the entire country could be taken over, however, Chinese soldiers flooded into North Korea. American forces were steadily beaten back behind the border. In 1951, U.S. troops again reached the border, where the war continued for the next 2 years. In 1953, an armistice was signed with the border lying across the 38th parallel, virtually unmoved.
Once World War II had ended, the continent of Europe was split into two, one siding with the United States and the other siding with the Soviet Union. This division was known as the Iron Curtain. This was furthered when in 1949, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed. This group was between the United States and most of Western Europe. Its goal was to deter the USSR from invading any of Western Europe. This was done through Article 3 of the treaty that makes all signees promise to back any other signee that is attacked. Then, in 1955, the Warsaw Pact formed. This was a direct counter to NATO between the Soviet Union and its allies. It also included a clause in which all members must come to the defense of each other. Article 4. These treaties made sure that the two superpowers never attacked each other.
The arms race between the U.S. and USSR did not happen at one given time, but happened throughout the Cold War. This began in 1945 when the U.S. developed the world's first nuclear weapon. This development caused the USSR to envy the U.S. and begin its own process of building nuclear weapons. With the first Soviet nuclear test happening in 1949, the arms race began. Bigger and better bombs, as well as missiles, were being produced all throughout the Cold War. This culminated in both sides having the ability to strike anywhere in the world within 1 hour. The stockpiling of these weapons hit its peak in 1985 when the USSR had over 40,000 warheads and the US had 23,000 warheads.
In 1959, President Fulgencio Batista was overthrown, and Fidel Castro came to power. Castro cut ties with the U.S. and began relations with the Soviet Union. The CIA worked with counter-revolutionary Cubans, and in April 1961 launched the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a disaster. Castro defeated the invasion in 2 days and strengthened his power. In July of 1962, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev made a deal with Castro to transport nuclear missiles to deter any future invasions. In September, U.S. surveillance flights discovered the missile sites. U.S. President John F. Kennedy issued a naval quarantine on the nation of Cuba. Negotiations followed, resulting in the U.S. removing its nuclear missiles from Turkey and the Soviet Union removing theirs from Cuba.
The Vietnam War ended with a severe loss to the United States. What is called the Vietnam Syndrome swept across the U.S. as a result of the war and the Carter era. Ronald Reagan vowed to end this Vietnam Syndrome by restoring the nation's confidence in the military and the military's confidence in itself. Reagan promised a policy of peace through strength, believing that only by building up American armed forces strong enough to defeat the Soviet Union could the United States deter the communists from instigating World War III. Upon taking office in 1980, Reagan dramatically increased spending on the military. Along with military spendings came research and development of sophisticated new equipment. Many people believe that Reagan's military efforts eventually sparked the USSR to develop their own militaristic technology, however.
Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev compromised through their actions and policies to end the Cold War. Star Wars was a strategic defense system that would protect the United States from any attack from Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs. This would be done by destroying the missiles before they made contact. This program would require a significant advancement in technological systems, as most weapons were undeveloped for this extreme task. One potential candidate was laser battle stations, which would attack moving Soviet targets with high-power lasers. Additionally, air and ground-based missiles using sensors, radar, optical, and infrared threat detection systems would be made a last line of defense. However, Reagan realized that if peace with the Soviets was to ever be made, this system could not be implemented. Although he was the one who came up with this system, he compromised in a way that allowed both the US and USSR to ease tensions with one another. In the 1980s, Gorbachev enacted a series of political reforms, most notably perestroika and glasnost. These gave the people of the Soviet Union more political and economic freedoms. Politically, they introduced contested elections, the Congress of People's Deputies, which was a new parliament that allowed for non-Communist Party members to take seats, vastly decreased censorship of government actions, and allowed citizens to freely criticize government officials. Economically, they allowed for the ownership of private businesses, bringing Russia from a purely government-controlled command economy to a more openly mixed economy.
In 1989, Ronald Reagan went to the Berlin Wall to deliver one of the most famous speeches of all time. This speech was designed to ease tensions in Berlin and hopefully allow free passage between the two sides of the city one day. Reagan and Gorbachev both clearly wanted peace. This was both before and after the speech, through their meetings. In the speech, Reagan told Gorbachev to, quote, tear down this wall. About 29 months after the speech, the wall fell. The Soviet leader and the American president had finally achieved something the world never thought was possible.
Through his policies of glasnost and perestroika, Gorbachev sacrificed his stable seat of power at the head of the Soviet Union, not only weakening his position through the policies themselves, but also from the backlash he faced from the communist majority. Reagan went back on his initial ideals of peace through strength and had to put an end to his own project for a national defense system. Both leaders had to give up a lot to end the Cold War, but their compromise led to the significantly more stable global scene we have now.